What kind of company is Neuralink? Why does it exist? What are brain-machine interfaces? And how could a future look like where Neuralink is one of the most important companies ever created? In this video, we look again at the blog post from Tim Urban about Elon Musk and his companies. It's 5 different parts, and this is the last part now, which was written in 2017. And it's about Neuralink and the brain's magical future, as Tim calls it. And he says that this company could really outdo Tesla and SpaceX in every manner and could be really one of the most important companies to be ever created. But also it has one of the most challenging engineering problems ever. And today we will dive in very deep into all of these topics, into the brain, into brain-machine interfaces, into why Neuralink makes sense and how a future with Neuralink could look like. And to do that, we need some context. So Tim begins very, very early, namely 600 million years ago. So back then there was the sponge. The sponge didn't have any nerves, let alone any brain or something like that. Then the jellyfish, 580 million before Christ, was the first organism to have nerves and the first nervous system. Then, some million years later, the flatworm developed the first brain ever. With the frog, also feelings emerged. Then with the rodent, it becomes a bit more interesting already, and the limbic system started to develop. Then, a long time after that, in 80 million BC, mammals started to develop, and also the neocortex in the brain. And from the mammals, the primates developed, then the great apes, and finally the hominid. The hominid was already quite similar to the modern-day human. He started to wear clothes and make use of fire, developed different tools, and started thinking. And then finally, around 100,000 years ago, there was a big breakthrough, namely language. Tim describes it here with a rock that is needed by someone, and then they started to just say one word, and that's how they could communicate with each other. Sounds a bit silly now, but this was very revolutionary and made things so much easier. And by 50,000 before Christ, there was a full complex language. So people could share stories with each other, and they could also share what they have learned, also to new generations. Tim shows it here with this graph. He says that a knowledge a certain tribe has develops a little bit over time, but if you have language, it develops way faster because the information can get transported through space and time, basically. So a kind of collective intelligence started to exist, and over the next thousands of years, the first complex social structures emerged, and they developed farming and domestication, and around 10,000 BC, the first cities started to emerge. In these cities, it was possible for information to spread way better and way faster with the network effect, and that's how the development of humans started to skyrocket, especially around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago when writing was invented. And in the 15th century, this got even way more efficient through the breakthrough of the printing press. At first, this technology was very lumpy and very slow. For example, Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press, his first project was to print copies of the Bible, and for 180 copies of the Bible, it took him 2 years. But then this technology improved very fast over the next years and centuries. And so with this development, Tim says that the era of mass communication has begun. Tim calls it the human Colossus. Innovation got even faster, and we started to develop locomotives, cars, the light bulb, the telephone, industrial machines, then the radio and the TV. And in the middle of the 20th century, we also started to create value-creating machines, namely the digital computer. So the first digital computers were created in the 1940s. Then personal computers became common in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, also the internet emerged. And with computers, Tim says that for us it was possible for the first time to not only outsource physical work, but information processing. And with all these computers connected through the internet, Tim says a new giant arose, namely the computer Colossus. Tim compares it to a nervous system of a human. So he says through the internet, the world was connected for the first time like a nervous system connects the body and makes it more efficient. So soon billions of people had access to all the information in the world. And over the next centuries, computers became faster and cheaper and more widespread. And today, every one of us has a machine like this in their pockets and has access to all the information in the world. And now at this point, Tim stops and he starts to make some deep dives that are necessary to understand the whole picture of Neuralink. And he says that knowledge is kind of like a tree where you have to build from the ground up. So this will be the next parts of this video and of the blog post. Part 2 will be about the brain. Then part 3 will be about brain-machine interfaces. Part 4, getting to the wizard era. So what Tim calls the era of Neuralink. Then he describes the wizard era. And then finally, he will say why Elon Musk started Neuralink and what the vision is. So in the next chapters, we should keep that image in mind. And we will start the deep dive with part 2, the brain. Tim says when he researched the brain for this article, he found out that the brain is actually very uncute and upsetting looking. Also, he says that the brain is probably one of the most complex objects we know as a species. And for that matter, also one of the most efficient things because it's operating on 20 watts, which is about the same amount of energy 2 Wi-Fi routers use or one iPad at full capacity. So it doesn't use a lot of energy, but still it's working so efficiently and it's so interesting and complex. He starts by explaining that under your skin, you actually have a few more layers until you get to the skull. And then from the skull downwards, there's also some more layers that come before the actual brain. The last layer before the actual brain is the pia mater, and it's actually fused together with the outside of the brain. These fibers here in the arachnoid mater serve as a protection layer and also as a shock absorber for the brain. Here's another view here from the top, and from left to right there's always one layer less, and in the end here all the way on the right you can see just the brain. And scientists describe the consistency of the brain somewhere between jello and pudding. Scientists believe that we actually understand almost nothing, like a very, very small part of how the brain actually works. Tim tries to cover the basics here and begins by zooming out. Tim says there's 3 divisions that you can undertake here in the brain. There's the reptilian brain, that's a very, very old part. He depicts it here with a frog. Then there's the mammalian brain, the limbic system, which he puts with a monkey. And then there's the neomammalian, the cortex, which is typically for the more recent humans. So the inner part here, the reptilian brain, it's very, very old. It's also called the brainstem, and it has developed with the very early frogs already, so it has been there for a long time. Then the limbic system, also called cerebellum, acts as a survival system, deals with emotions and is the foundation for social structures. And finally, the neocortex, or the cerebrum, is in charge of almost everything complex. So it's about thinking, feeling, personality, planning, movement, language, and signal processing in general. So it's about processing all signals. It's responsible for language, for thinking, for planning, for strategizing, and much more. Tim goes on a very, very deep dive here, describes all the different parts and its functions. I just want to highlight a few parts of the neocortex here, which I think is the most interesting parts. The first thing is the primary motor cortex, which is here in the frontal lobe, and this is responsible for all our body's movements. And similarly, a bit more here in the front, in the parietal lobe, there is the sense of touch, which is in this strip here in the primary somatosensory cortex. These 2 strips are one of the best known and well-mapped areas of the brain that we know. Then here in the temporal lobe is where most of your memories are stored and also where your hearing is. Also makes sense because it's very close to where the ears are. And then here in the occipital lobe, the visual cortex is located. And this part here is almost entirely dedicated to vision, so how you see. And now the interesting part is that the whole neocortex that you see here is actually just a 2 millimeters thick layer, and it's just wrinkled a lot. So if you would take the neocortex and stretch it out, then it would be way bigger than the brain itself. So if you would stretch it out and you would get a sheet like this, it would be a 48 times 48 centimeters square. And actually it is wrinkled so much that it is still more than 1/3 of the brain's volume. Tim points out here again that this is where most of the action in your brain actually happens. It's where you think, move, feel, see, hear, remember, speak, and understand language. And in comparison to the brain itself, it would look like this. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine, but apparently this is the comparison. And now, after zooming out a lot, Tim now zooms in on the smallest part, the neuron. Now, the neuron itself was already discovered in the late 19th century, but only in the 1950s did we understand how neurons communicate with each other. To explain this, Tim compares a neuron to a person, and he says if one neuron would be one person, then this would be the neuron. The soma is the neuron body, so the head. The dendrites are the connections to other neurons. Then the guy's body stem is the axon, which at this scale could be as long as 1 kilometer if this neuron would be the size of a person. And then the axon terminals are the other side of the neuron, which also has connections to other neurons. These connections are called synapses, and here is where chemicals called neurotransmitters are interchanged between neurons. And if enough of those neurotransmitters are exchanged, then an action potential is triggered, which electrocutes this cell. And this action potential can either be triggered or not triggered. So it's a binary situation. It's either 0 or 1. And then this action potential can trigger further action potentials. And this is how information moves through the nervous system. The information speed can vary a lot here. And it depends a lot on the myelin sheath, which is a layer that protects the neurons and also makes the information go much faster. So you can see here, there are no myelin sheaths here, and it slowly moves forward. But then on this side, it moves very quickly. And Tim brings a good example here. He says that when you hit a toe, the information that the toe is hit gets sent to the brain very quickly, but then only like 2 seconds after, you actually feel the pain of the toe. So this is the same here. And now considering that the information is sent with a binary information flow, so either it's 0 or 1, it could be compared to a computer transistor. But the big difference is that the brain's neurons are constantly changing. And this is also how it's possible that we learn new skills, that we adapt to new situations. The neurons are able to alter themselves chemically, structurally, and also functionally. And this is a phenomenon that is called neuroplasticity. This neuroplasticity is highest in babies, but it actually is a phenomenon that is with us our whole lives. And Tim points out that if we want to use that for learning new skills, then repetition is very important, because at some point the brain will actually have physically built the changes into the brain. Now, the brain has around 100 billion neurons, which is a lot. It's similar to the number of stars in the Milky Way. And around 15 to 20 of those are in the neocortex. And the brain material can be divided into 2 different materials, in gray matter and white matter, where in the gray matter the calculations are happening and the white matter is more the connections to other regions of the brain. So this is an illustration. For example, here in the neocortex you can see this is all gray matter, and then the white matter is connections to other parts of the brain. Also here in this part you can see this is all gray matter. And the information can be sent to other parts of the brain, but it can actually also be sent outwards into the whole body through the nervous system. We have the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and then we have the peripheral nervous system, which reaches out to the rest of the body. And now going back to the point that we don't really understand how the brain works, Tim says, when we zoom in, we understand how individual neurons work, how they are firing, how they're communicating with other neurons. And when we zoom out, we also know which region has which function and so on. But all the middle part, all the things in between, we don't really understand. And he compares it to the economy. We can describe one consumer very well, and we can describe macroeconomic forces a lot. But how the actual market is working, how this all functions and how this will be in the future, no one can predict. So this is very similar. Tim describes all of this in much detail. There are a lot of different types of cells, and I encourage every one of you to read this, but for this video, we move on to part 3, the brain-machine interfaces. Okay, so if we look at the picture of the tree again, the first foundation, the foundation of the trunk, was the brain. Now we move on to the second part, which is the brain-machine interfaces. Tim begins by taking a person from 50,000 before Christ, and he says he brings this guy from 50,000 years ago to 2017. And he says that there's a lot of really crazy things, like the Burj Khalifa and planes and a lot of crazy technology. And basically his reaction to this is, it looks like that. A lot of changes, a lot of innovation. But actually when it comes to language, it's still the same. It's still the same as how we did it 50,000 years ago. Having discussed this point, Tim sends him back to 50,000 years ago. Next he says that there are 2 fundamental questions the BMIs have to answer. First, how do I get the right information out of the brain? So how can I read the signals of the brain? And then second, more difficult actually, how do I send the right information into the brain? So how can I communicate with the brain from outside? How can I stimulate the brain so that it can read the information? So basically BMIs want to take over the job of what normally neurons do in the brain, communicating with the brain and out of the brain. Now that is actually a very complex task. To illustrate the point of how complex this is, Tim says if we take this napkin, the folded out brain, and we scale it up to the size of a few blocks of New York City, so we scale it up 1000x, 1000 times, and then we take a cubic meter out of that, so a box that is 1 meter times 1 meter times 1 meter. Then in this box there would be 40,000 neurons, and these neurons would have 20 million connections, so 20 million synapses between them. Also, there are not just normal neurons, there are also glial cells, and these glial cells are also 40,000 in one of these boxes. And then additionally, there are also the blood vessels that come through all of these cells and synapses. And so in the end, it's a jungle of different kind of cells and blood vessels and a lot of different things. So all of this sits in our square box. And this square box, which we now imagine as 1 meter, in reality, in the brain, this is 1 millimeter. So it's a box of 1 millimeter times 1 millimeter times 1 millimeter. So it's a very tiny thing, and there are thousands and millions of different objects in this thing. And the blood vessels alone, if you would expand it to the 1 meter box, there would be 1 kilometer of blood vessels only in this box. So even in the small 1 millimeter square box, there is actually 1 meter of blood vessels. For me, that's very hard to imagine, but it's just very stuffed. So basically, we can all be happy that this is not our problem, because it's a very hard problem to solve. But there are some solutions, and Tim looks at different BMI tools here. There are 3 criteria that a BMI tool can be measured on. First, the scale, so how many neurons can be recorded or activated. Then the resolution, so how detailed is the information. And then the invasiveness, so how much of a surgery is needed, or how much do you have to actually physically cut into the brain. And right now at this moment, these criteria all have a trade-off between them. So you don't have a perfect BMI tool, but you have BMI tools that are quite good at one of these or 2 of those criteria. He starts with the fMRI, which is classically not a BMI recording tool, but it's used a lot, and it basically tracks the blood flow in the brain, and therefore it indicates which areas of the brain needs more oxygen, and therefore which brain area has the most activity. The scale is quite good. As you can see, you can look at the whole brain. It's not invasive at all, which is good, but the resolution is quite low. Then he describes 4 more technologies. To imagine it better, he says that if the brain would be a stadium, then the EEG would be like a microphone outside of the stadium. So you can record a lot of different things, but the spatial resolution is very, very low. Then the ECOG would be like a microphone inside of the stadium. So it's already way closer to the brain, but still the spatial resolution is quite low. Then the local field potential would be like a microphone over one specific section of the stadium. And it's already quite invasive. These needles here go directly into the brain. And then you have the single unit recording, and that would be like a microphone hanging over one single person. So this actually measures one single neuron in the brain. The problem here is that the scale is very low and it's very invasive. Now, all of these technologies have been worked on and improved a lot since this blog post in 2017, but there's not been a really big breakthrough yet. So it's just smaller and cheaper and better, but not a lot different. But if you imagine that this innovation here continues for the next 10, 50, 100 years, then in the future, it would be like comparing the first computers to the iPhone. And then if you would compare the early BMIs to X, so insert the new BMIs, then this device could be very, very futuristic and advanced. Now, Tim says there are 3 types of BMIs that are used already today. The first one is using the motor cortex as a remote control. So the motor cortex is the part of the brain that controls our motions, and it's also one of the most well-mapped areas. And this is actually already used today. So the BMI is put into the brain, and then the brain or the person wearing the BMI needs to learn how to activate the BMI in such a way that it understands the movements it wants to do. So the neurons that are used to move the arm, for example, will be trained so the BMI can understand it. And then the robotic arm can be moved in exactly this way. And Tim shows a few examples here of a person controlling a computer with his brain. And also she controls the robotic arm and feeds herself the drink just by thinking. Today this is much more advanced and people can really control the whole computer and can work on the computer, play advanced video games, etc. And Tim says a future version of this could be that the brain doesn't just communicate with a computer, but that brains could actually communicate with each other. So it would be a brain-to-brain communication. Then the second type of BMI is artificial ears and eyes. This is also already used in 2017 and of course also more advanced now in 2026. It's basically artificial ears and eyes, and they take the signal from the outside world and decode it and put it back into the brain so that the brain can understand it. Artificial ears are actually quite common already. Already back in 2017, this was quite common. Artificial eyes, on the other hand, are still not so good, even now in 2026. And then the third option that Tim puts here is deep brain stimulation. Here the wires go very deep into the brain and they're connected to a device like this one here. And the device can help to change the neurons firing in these regions, and therefore it can help with diseases like Parkinson's disease or with people with OCD or when people have seizures. And these kind of devices are still used in 2026 and are more advanced than back in 2017. And then arguably, if we look at today in 2026, there would probably be a fourth family of BMIs that are already used today, and that is communication. So there exists BMIs today that can output speech of people that cannot speak themselves or output text that cannot type themselves. Okay, and now that we have a better understanding of BMIs, we can look at Neuralink specifically. What is Neuralink's challenge? Tim says when he made his posts of Tesla and SpaceX, he noticed that there's a formula that Elon Musk uses. And that's also what the question is here. Like, how will the boxes of this formula be filled with Neuralink? So Tim says Elon Musk's formula is this. There's always a starting point, and then there's an end point with an increased chance of a good future. And then there is some match that gets activated that ignites an industry. For example, with Tesla, it was the EV industry, and with SpaceX, it was the space industry. Then for this to happen, there needs to be a sustainable business model that funds this company innovation. And then if this industry gets ignited, there is an industry innovation and the goal is met. And then the result of the goal is that the chance of a good future is increased. So this is the formula that needs to be filled in with the companies of Elon Musk. As an example, he puts Tesla here and says that starting point is everyone drives a gas car. There should be an affordable electric car. To get there needs to be a business model, which is make and sell cars. And the company has certain innovations that bring these affordable electric cars. And then there's an industry innovation. And the goal of a more sustainable energy world is met. The result of the goal is reduced risk of environmental or economic catastrophe. And that means there's an increased chance of a good future. The same is also filled in for the SpaceX. And now the question is, what is this for Neuralink? How does this look for Neuralink? So this graph will slowly be filled in the next pages of this blog post and also in the next minutes of this video. And in the end, we will have the full Neuralink formula. What we know now is the goal of the company is to make sort of a wizard head, and we have the starting point now. So let's see how this will get filled in. Before he describes the major hurdles for Neuralink, he describes that the founding team of Neuralink is filled with really smart and really accomplished people. They have experts in a wide variety of fields, for example, chip design, materials, also already brain-machine interfaces, and also neuroscience. The first box here, the sustainable business model, is quite clear. They want to make a brain-machine interface that brings money, and that is so good that it ignites a whole industry to emerge. But what are the hurdles? What are the problems that need to be overcome for that to happen? The first point Tim explains is public skepticism. But in the end, he says probably people will change their minds over time when they see how it is working and that it is safe, etc. Then another hurdle could be angry giants, like in the Tesla and SpaceX posts. It would be companies that are already well established in this field. But actually Neuralink is stepping into a new field, so there are no big players. But one hurdle that is really major is the bandwidth. Tim says that for BMIs to be a mass product, there needs to be way higher bandwidth. At the time of this blog post, there was around 100 or 500 neurons that could be reached maximum in a BMI. Now in 2026, it's a few thousand, like 5,000 or 6,000, but still there needs to be way more. And one way to solve this could be that the speed of progress is similar to Moore's law in computer chips, where it's an exponential growth. And if this happens, then we could be at 1 million in the year 2034. So in another 8 years from here. So the solving of this hurdle depends on how the progress will continue with BMIs. Then the second major hurdle is implantation. Tim says when he talked to the people at Neuralink, one word that was said a lot is non-invasive or non-invasively. So this is really a big topic at Neuralink, and the logic is that it should be non-invasive to really be a mass product. And also, if you have to open the skull, it's a major safety issue and it's also expensive. And then next to these two major hurdles, bandwidth and implantation, there's also some other hurdles like biocompatibility, that it needs to be compatible with the brain. Then miniaturization, that the smaller the better, so it needs to be smaller. Then another hurdle is that you send information in and out at the same time, and this electrically, chemically, and mechanically. And then lastly, in order to communicate properly, you really have to understand the brain, which is also a big challenge. Okay, then let's look at some current BMI innovations. Firstly, there's the concept of a silk layer that could be put on the brain surface and that has some transistors. Today, this idea is a bit further, but it's still in the research stage. Then another idea is similar to a tattoo. It's a thin layer of electrodes that's printed on the skin and maybe in the future also on the brain. Today this exists already, but only on the skin, and it's used as a sensor. And there are some more cool ideas that also in 2026 haven't made it out of the research stage. For example, this neural mesh, which is kind of a net that is injected directly into the brain. And also a really cool idea is the neural dust, which is a little machine that sits directly on top of the cortex. The name neural dust refers to these little guys that sit on top of the brain, and they are spread around the cortex, and they communicate with this device that sits outside of the skull with ultrasound. And Tim also mentions two more out there ideas like optogenetics and carbon nanotubes. But all of these innovations try to work on this thing here, on the company innovation that may provide the breakthrough in bandwidth and implantation. And Tim says it's only a matter of time until the human Colossus recognizes the economic opportunity here, and then the innovation will skyrocket the whole industry. Tim says that once BMIs are established, then the next step will be a whole brain interface, and he calls it a wizard head. Elon Musk calls it a digital tertiary layer, so kind of like the third layer. When we have the animal brain, then the more advanced cortex, and then we have the third layer that would be the wizard head. And Tim says that if we are honest about it, we are actually already kind of a cyborg today with the laptops, with the mobile phones we use every day and all the time. We are basically already a cyborg, and this wizard head would just be a really good upgrade to this. It would be an upgrade to a high bandwidth cyborg. And Tim says this could really allow for a totally new era. He says that until now we had two eras. First, the isolated brains, so where humans couldn't talk to each other, they couldn't really communicate with each other. Then we had the indirect brain communication, which would be up to until the wizard head is available. And then there would be direct brain communication, which would be totally different. And then Tim goes on to explain a few examples of how the wizard head would change our lives totally. He begins by explaining that if we could directly communicate with a computer, we could also directly communicate with devices, then also sensory communication. In the future, an influencer could not just do a live stream of a video, but he could share all of the senses he feels in a moment where he's traveling or doing a bungee jump or whatever. And you could also maybe even store memories, and there's basically no limit to imagination here. And it can also go in very dark places. For example, when somebody gets hacked and the memories just get deleted or changed and manipulated. And then next to this outside communication, there's also the internal communication that can change a lot. Your cravings and other feelings you have. Then also the knowledge part is quite crazy to think about that in the future, if you have the highest level, you could actually know everything just by thinking about it, because the information is already here and you just have to think about it and it will be instantly available to your mind. Can be really scary to think about all the consequences. But Tim says in the end, hopefully, like most technologies, it will be a net positive for humanity. But now to the last part, to the final part, which will solve the puzzle of what is the end goal here and how could it increase the chance of a good future for humanity. Tim begins by explaining that basically we could witness a very big shift in human history right now, where we go from a single planet species to a multi-planet species. Also at the same time, we see that AI is improving a lot. And also interestingly, this post was from 2017. So back then there was no ChatGPT or similar models. And with this very powerful AI, there comes great risk, but also great opportunity. So we could head basically for a really good or a really bad future. Now, Elon Musk was thinking of how he could make that good future more likely. And a big part of this thinking is also to make the economic incentive big enough that the good future will be more likely, so that the steps will be taken for a good future to come more likely. For example, with Tesla, this incentive was to create a really good EV so that consumers want to buy it and car companies want to have their own EV, want to build their own EV. So the goal of Neuralink must be to be so good, to make such good BMIs that the industry behind it will emerge and grow bigger by itself because the economic incentive is so big. And if we look at the bigger picture, there's even a bigger plan of Elon. Let's look at it. So what is Elon's plan to make AI most probably safe? Elon's logic is that the best thing is to democratize AI. And democracy is of the people, by the people, for the people. That's the centerpiece of democracy. There's a good quote from Churchill who said, "Democracy is the worst of all systems of government except for all the others." So this mantra of by the people, for the people, this was originally the idea behind OpenAI, created by Sam Altman and Elon Musk. If we compare it to now in 2026, it's a bit different because Elon Musk was suing OpenAI and right now they are in court fighting against each other. But that was originally the idea behind OpenAI, to make a non-profit AI research company discovering and enacting the path to safe artificial general intelligence. So the idea is to democratize AI. But even then, AI can get more powerful and more intelligent, and there's still a great risk that it could go evil. So one solution to that is, and this needs a bit of an open mind, that we should be AI. But stay with me. This is where we get back to the wizard head. This is basically the third layer of our brain. And over time, we more and more will become one with that layer. It will feel natural to us. It will feel like the cortex feels to the animal system. It feels natural and just normal. So if the wizard head has enough bandwidth and enough intelligence, it could feel like you have the ability of AI. It could feel like you are AI in a sense. And this is very hard to imagine. And also Tim describes that sometimes he feels like he gets the idea and then it snaps out again. But this is the idea behind becoming AI. So AI will become very, very intelligent. And the better we are connected to the wizard head, the better we are communicating with it, the more we are integrated with this AI. So that's why the bandwidth is so important here. And there's a good quote from Elon that sums up the idea quite good. We're going to have the choice of either being left behind and being effectively useless, or like a pet, like a house cat or something, or eventually figuring out some way to be symbiotic and merge with AI. And then a second later he says, a house cat's a good outcome, by the way. So AI will just be so powerful that us humans, in comparison, will feel like a house cat or even less. I like the analogy here if we say that we as humans want to build a road and there's an ant colony in the way. It's not like we are evil, but we will just make a road anyway, and maybe the ants will not be there anymore afterwards. And the same could be with AI. AI would just be so much more intelligent and capable that us humans would be there, but hopefully also important to the AI. And so all of this is the reason why Elon started Neuralink. So let's look again at the final Neuralink formula. So first we have the starting point. Then there are breakthroughs necessary in bandwidth and implantation that could ignite the whole industry. And this company innovation must be fueled by developing cutting-edge BMIs. So this needs a sustainable business model. Then if these breakthroughs allow for the industry innovation, there will be a mass adoption of the whole brain interface, so the better BMI. Then the goal is to have a widespread human-AI integration, which will then reduce the existential risk, and therefore this is an increased chance of a good future for humanity. And with this, I say thank you for watching. If you liked this video or this video series, feel free to share it, like and subscribe, and see you soon. Bye bye.